I started my video on Tuesday with this view looking down the globe and particularly the trade winds here over in the West Pacific. I'm going to do the same thing here today on Friday, and I'm actually showing the same exact data. So this is old data from Tuesday morning, and it's kind of how we started out that video as well. And the reason I'm doing that is because I mentioned in that video that I wanted to watch if this westerly wind burst here in the West Pacific was going to migrate east like a lot of the forecasts said it would. And we typically see near the equator, especially in the Pacific, these strong trade winds. These were helping to influence the development of La Nina here this winter. And if this westerly wind burst is in fact going to kind of cross through here, get out into the Pacific, it would help to weaken that, erode La Nina, and kind of kick us off potentially here in 2026 toward a journey of getting ourselves into El Nino at some point this year. So that was my focus. So I'm going to jump forward to today, just 3 days later here on Friday, and see if we're seeing that migration to the east. And if I do that, and we look at those trade winds here this morning, they've made that jump. They're now east of Indonesia, still kind of within it, starting to get out into the West Pacific. And you can see the trade winds here kind of eroding as they do that. Now, if you look here, you have your easterlies here, you have your westerlies here, and between that, you have convergence. Air's colliding between that, and you typically get lift and thunderstorms here. And this is part of the MJO. So it's why we see typically MJO activity, kind of right at the nose of these westerly wind bursts, especially where they collide with the nose of the easterlies that are prevailing in the Pacific. So, all right, let's put that together and see, do we see that kind of thunderstorm activity ultimately here over the West Pacific? And if we just look here this morning, an infrared satellite, there it is. Instead of kind of sitting right over Indonesia, maybe like it was earlier, now sitting off the continent, northeast of Australia here in the West Pacific. So indicative of that movement of the MJO coming out into like phases 6 and 7, maybe making the rounds to 8, 1 and 2. We'll have to talk about that as it relates to February. But it's kind of neat to put this together here. What we talked about on Tuesday, seeing some of it now come to fruition here on Friday. This is, I think, tropical storm Nokain. I believe that's how it's pronounced. Now getting very close, if not impacting the Philippines here. It looks a little bit starting to organize a bit maybe, but running out of time to do so. That's just a tropical storm. We showed this diagram, Eric's shown it here this week, I think from a different website. These are the Hobmuller diagrams showcasing those westerly wind bursts in that red color here. And earlier this week on like the 13th and the 12th, the westerly wind burst was here, so like lined up right over the maritime continent. But here on the 16th, it's starting, the nose of that is starting to push east of the continent, getting closer to the date line here. And we just confirmed that. So we didn't even need to look at the chart to show you and figure out for ourselves where that wind burst nose was, right here where the thunderstorms are developing. There's been kind of a product of this as well. If you look at Australia's rainfall over the last 30 to 60 days, we've seen more of it in the north, some drought concerns popping up more so in southern Australia, the southeast portion of the continent. There you can see that even from the drought monitor with, again, that kind of north-south divide here in summer for the month. And it's kind of an ongoing story that we're watching. Closer to North America here, the big story here this morning, at least on Friday, are the strong winds heading out of Canada through the kind of western and high plains here. You can see the continental divide showing up where those winds end here through Colorado and Wyoming. But strong winds pushing northwest to southeast, and seeing those wind observations pick up here this morning. Recording this about 6:30 Central Time, and already starting to see those wind gusts peak in this area here. Sustained winds up well over 30 miles an hour, kind of pushing near 40 mile an hour in some of these areas, especially near the Black Hills. And we're going to see that continue today. I'm just showing the 3-kilometer NAM maximum wind gust. Play this forward through the day today on Friday. See, about the time recording this video, we're already getting up into the 50s here in terms of those max wind gusts. As we go closer to lunchtime, southeast Wyoming, portions of west Nebraska, northeast Colorado, the Platte River. Looking at wind gusts exceeding 50 miles an hour, getting close to kind of that more damaging threshold near 60. Play that forward through this evening. Seeing this fill in a little bit with those max wind gusts approaching 60 miles an hour across a decently wide corridor here. There is this cutoff, and the National Weather Service has kind of been struggling as to how far east they're extending some of these high wind warnings. I will say the high wind warnings, I'll show you these in just a second, have extended further east than this forecast just from the 3-kilometer NAM would tell us. In fact, the GFS has pushed some of these strongest wind gusts a little bit toward the central part of the Dakotas, Nebraska, and a little bit into Kansas. As a result, if you look at the high wind warnings here in this, for lack of a better word, mustard color, It stretches into the central part of those states and much of western Kansas at this point. Red flag warnings kind of sprinkled in here as well with those high winds and some drier conditions further to the south, and then wind advisories across portions of west and north Texas here with a few high wind watches in there as well. Winter weather advisories out for the let's call this like the northern Corn Belt here, western Iowa, western Minnesota, the eastern Dakotas here, northeast Nebraska. Snow showers moving through this corridor here. And if we jump over and look at radar just really quickly, we can zoom that in a little bit. Nope. There's those snow showers cutting through that area here. We have some forming through the Midwest, saw a dusting of snow kind of through this corridor overnight. And those snow showers just swinging around this big low pressure system and trough that's heading almost due north to south across the continental U.S. The low is kind of maybe somewhere up here, and the air just spinning around it in that fashion. I do want to jump back to the all hazards map really quickly. Underneath that ridge, Eric pointed this out yesterday, we have this big dominant ridge out west. It actually goes well up to the north, north of the domain here, but just for the sake of drawing it, it comes in somewhere like that. And very dominant. And underneath that high, we have stagnant air and dense fog advisories, which is not uncommon in the west underneath these big ridges because they typically have a temperature inversion lower. And that temperature inversion traps particulates, smog, and fog underneath it without getting much mixing in there. I do want to mention, look at the freeze warning across the southeast, kind of our citrus belt here through central Florida. I mean, these freeze warnings are very far south. I mean, all the way down through almost the southern tip of Florida, getting close to the Everglades at this point. So impressive to see freeze warnings that far south. That's here for this morning. Right here this morning, if we jump over and look at current temperatures, I mean, you're getting down into the mid-30s, well into the southern portion of Florida. Now, the actual freezes, if we go, let's go investigate a little bit closer because I want to see which areas are actually down into that damaging hard freeze territory, because if you just touch 31, 32, that's not always the most damaging, but you get down below 28 for a number of hours. I mean, look at 21, 23 through the northwest portion. Gainesville, 24 this morning. I mean, that is very cold. Not sure if we're breaking records here, but we're probably close. 22 southwest of Gainesville. Found a 28 here, kind of near the spine of Florida, and another 28 here, just northwest of the lake. So impressive cold here this morning. Fortunately, outside of those few little obs here, I imagine these are kind of in low-lying areas, south of that line here where there's a lot of citrus. Still seeing, 25, getting close to the coast here. Tampa's just down here at 40. It kind of depends on where exactly you are, but, Miami in the 40s. But you go north into Georgia, 22, 24, 20, 19, 25, 21 over by Charleston and Savannah there. So just a very cold morning waking up in the southeast. Otherwise, cold kind of bracketed across the northeast, and then the winds out of the north, ushering more of this cold down through the Midwest. We'll see that as we go through the temperature forecast today, and then I'll take it through next week just in a second here. I mentioned that ridge, that dominant ridge over the western U.S., that trough kind of spread broadly across the eastern U.S. here. This showcases it nicely, just looking at those 500 millibar winds. Large ridge all the way up into Canada. I mean, this ridge, if you count this little trough here near Hawaii, it stretches almost northeast of Hawaii all the way up into Alaska. Now the jet stream diving back down through the Midwest. I mean, this is a very amplified pattern that we're seeing across North America right now. And it's part of that, amplified pattern while we're seeing, anomalous freezes all the way down here in Florida, and the warmth, the fog, there's kind of stagnant, hazardous air warnings here all the way in the west. It's kind of the pairing of the two different hazard types here in the middle of winter. All right, I want to jump over and look at the ECMWF snowfall. I have some kind of interesting snow stories, potential snowfall. I'm going to put that in quotes right now across the southeast because my confidence, the chances for a lot of accumulating snow through this quarter here, the Carolinas, even into Georgia, maybe Florida. There was some talk of that even here at the end of this week. I think, unfortunately, some of that's waning here a bit. I think some snows kind of get down to the ground in this corridor. We'll look at it in a second here. First things first, here through the day today, snow showers continue across the upper Midwest. Likely to see some of those snow squalls continue. My colleague Andrew Pritchard is out kind of inadvertently chasing them around Illinois and Minnesota this week. Seeing a wide area where that activity is going to continue. And some of these stronger ones can put down a dusting to a half inch, especially if a few of them come over in a few hour period. So while accumulations aren't expected to be too significant, not like snow you're likely to shovel, some of these are going to get a little bit stronger. Now I have to exclude the lake effect belt because there's definitely plenty of snow coming for areas of western Michigan and portions of the eastern Midwest. We take this forecast in through Saturday morning. 6 a.m., you're seeing that cold front consolidate here across the southeast, pushing through North Carolina. Not very strong rainfall expected with that. Seeing some of those snow showers now push off into the mid-Atlantic, West Virginia, Maryland, New Jersey. It's seeing like New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts. We'll look at the snow totals here in a second. And as that cold front continues to like stall here and some of that cold air comes in behind it across the southeast, we're seeing some chances for snow here. Florida Panhandle, potentially seeing flakes. Southern Georgia up into the Carolinas briefly. And kind of that in quarter there, keeping an eye on for the potential for snow. Now, I'm going to look at that in a second here. I'm going to take this forecast out a little bit further. We stay in this pattern next week, but remember, by next week we were talking about that trough, which was here. Just looked at that, in the last slide. It's going to kind of be retrograding somewhere over here, and our hope was, and part of the forecast was, as it did that, we'd get better return flow out of the Gulf. So instead of that trough here, helping to push that Gulf moisture in like this, where we saw, a brief rain event across the southeast. If we move that trough over here, it's going to open that corridor up to get some of more of that moisture from the Atlantic, up into this corridor at least. And we start to see that next week with better rainfall chances across the southeast, and even, a snowfall chance, a more, significant. This would certainly be, shovelable snow across the mid-Atlantic, maybe even the metro east here by next week. And again, details on that cloudy given how far out that is, but certainly something to keep an eye on, in this whole kind of southeast third of the continental U.S. here, with additional snow showers and potentially some high winds behind it again for the front range, which has been no stranger to those this year. If we do look at the 3-kilometer NAM, I want to showcase maybe a little bit more of a mesoscale model, get some fine details out of the snow event expected for the southeast here. There's that initial cold front comes surging through, but you'll notice it kind of stalls here across the Atlantic and Gulf Coast here. As it does that, some colder air is allowed to kind of build in behind it. And as it transitions back over to rain, we're seeing this rain snow line set up somewhere here through the Carolinas, even into the Florida Panhandle. But I have some question. This kind of overrunning, where the air is kind of overrunning these backside cold front-like snow scenarios, they never deliver very strongly. They tend to underperform. So while I do expect flakes to fall in this area and maybe a narrow swath, get some like accumulating snow in here, maybe a dusting, can't rule out like maybe an inch. I'm pretty skeptical we're going to see a wide area of like snowfall that's going to pop up on satellite the next morning here as we go into Sunday evening or Monday morning. Could be wrong. For folks who are rooting for the snow here, good luck. For folks that don't want any business with it, I think it's kind of trending in your favor, at least at this point. If we just sum up the total of the 10-day snowfall from the European model, we see the results of those like snow squalls and those snow showers. Notice how there's no obvious pattern to the snow in this quarter here, just with those lows swinging through and around that trough. You're seeing like dustings to 2 inches and a really wide swath, both Canada and the northern U.S. here. You do get some better accumulations here over in the eastern Midwest, especially into those lake effect snow bands. We'll see that system coming through the mid-Atlantic potentially next weekend, and that's probably showing up with some of these higher values here through like Boston and New York. But if we exclude that, again, you're looking at that like dusting anywhere from like 1 to 2 inches. ECMWF curiously does have southern Georgia even into like the Florida Panhandle getting up near an inch. Accumulation-wise, that's probably more close to like half an inch. Like I said, can't rule out that there's these like little swaths in here, folks who get closer to like half an inch or an inch, but looking more like a dusting or just kind of some slushy, brief messes here in that corridor. If we sum that up too, just looking at the 10-day precipitation anomalies, again, quiet in the west. We saw that system start to show up near the end of next week, giving some rainfall across the southeast, but by and large, this is a dry pattern, somewhat, inactive, given that we're right here in the middle of winter, when we're typically seeing these bigger winter storms come through. So that dryness in the west starting to become a concern again. We obviously started very quick in California 2 times, kind of at the beginning of kind of the fall water year, and then later in December. But still, by and large, across the west, if we look at all these different basins, all the snowpack regions that we keep an eye on, doing kind of well in the Columbia River Basin. Next, a lot of this is going to get into that system and hydrology, but even immediately over here in like Yakima and the Cascades, really lacking for snowpack in that corridor here, lacking it in the southern Rockies as well. That could be relevant for the Colorado River next year. Kind of spines up like that. And Southern Sierras still doing well, but haven't had any snow recently, and they're not getting any obviously in that 10-day forecast. There are some hints, especially from the ECMWF ensemble that we'll look at, that this situation might be improving at the end of the month, early February, but this remains a concern as we push forward here this winter. Now we're getting closer to February. This is also an area I look at as we get into spring for severe weather, because if we have deep snowpack here, if this is all like green and blue in February and March, and then we get some drought into like northern Mexico, West Texas, what I call the kind of EML source region that's elevated mixed layer, that can help pull the trough down in spring. That picks up that dry air here over the kind of the high plains and then over here in the Mexican plateau, and those combine here across the middle or southern part of the country, and that's just a recipe for severe storms through this whole corridor here. And so when that signature of plus pre-severe minus pre-severe shows up, I get more concerned for the severe season in this quarter, especially kind of early in the severe season like March, April, and pushing into May. And I'm not seeing it. We're missing this ingredient here. We maybe have this one. We maybe have the lack of pre-severe. You can kind of see that in the southern Colorado Rockies snowpack deficit. And if we go up and look at like soil moisture estimates from satellites, that corridor here, definitely trending on the lower end of that pre-severe. Northern Mexico a little bit more in question, but we're not seeing that plus snowpack here embedded over the Rockies yet. Something I'll have to keep an eye on as we go closer toward the severe season. If we look at those minimum temperatures forecast here for today from the National Weather Service, you can see that cold here that we talked about across the southeast. Warmth actually right immediately ahead of that low here in Minnesota. Plus we have a lot of cloud cover keeping some temperatures up overnight. But those temperatures are going to be falling quickly here this weekend, Saturday into Sunday. Wide area of cold weather all the way through Arkansas into Texas. You're talking teens and Little Rock, impressive cold overnight going into Sunday morning. That continues on Monday, that cold pushing all the way back into Florida, across the southeast, the Atlantic coast, and the Gulf Coast, getting down into the 20s and the 30s for a wide chunk here. Last of the warmth remaining off to the east in Maine, and then staying warm across the west, obviously with that ridge dominating out there. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday next week, just walking it through quickly, you can kind of see there are some temperature swings in this corridor, kind of brief warm-ups and then cool-downs, but by and large, with that pattern still looking something like this at the end of next week, expecting this corridor to stay colder here. Warming up a bit in the southeast, though, as we get that return flow. If you get moisture in out of the Gulf, you're going to be warming it up in this area here. It's hard to bring in any sort of cold air from this trajectory. So while I talked about that return flow in the form of moisture, certainly heat will be a factor as well. And we can kind of see this play out if we look at the 500 millibar height anomalies, just from the ECMWF ensemble, play this out. And really, I'm washing over the changes this week quickly. What I want to get to is next week. If I go out into like Friday, that pattern that looked something like this here at the beginning of this week is starting to wash out, and that trough starting to retrograde back. Talked about that a few slides ago. That's opening up the warmth across the southeast. We see that in some ridging here and helping to push rainfall chances back into that area here, and potentially some snowfall kind of at the rain snow line, wherever that sets up here across the eastern Midwest and the mid-Atlantic next weekend. We can see this in the temperature anomalies, and this is looking out at the 0 to 5 day on the left, 5 to 10 days, taking us into like the middle of next week, and then in the long range, like through next weekend. If we look over the next 5 days, that temperature pattern looks like I drew earlier, a kind of amplified pattern. But we get into next week, and it looks more like that, with that trough centered more so over the middle part of the country, helping to bring that warmth up into the southeast and that precipitation later in the week. But in the long range, there's some little disagreements here. That ECMWF has more of the warmth pocketed here over across the southwest, still cold across the east, a little bit of cold coming back into the southeast, cold across the Canadian Prairie and the Shield, whereas the AFS and the GFS pushes that warmth a little bit further north, and the AFS certainly pushes it further north. And what's happening here is the ECMWF, if I play that forecast further out, like through next weekend, starting to build some troughing in here in the eastern Pacific, and it's squashing that ridge more across the southwest. It's actually building it a little bit into the southern plains, and it's keeping that trough across the northeast, which kept the eastern part of the country cool. But this pattern is kind of in disagreement from the GFS ensemble. We saw that just in the temperature forecast, where both the AFS and the GFS had that warmth further to the north than the ECMWF did. And there's some disagreements now showing up in the precipitation forecast too. The GFS ensemble wetter for much of the eastern half of the country out through next weekend. This takes us all the way out through January 30th. AIFS in somewhat agreement there, and with more rain across maybe British Columbia, kind of similar to the GFS. Look at the ECMWF ensemble. I know these are really small, but if I pull up the ensemble, it actually brings precipitation back into the Cascades, into the Northwest, even into the Sierras a bit, and keeps the precipitation to the east more so across the Southeast and the Mid-Atlantic than like all the way up into this corridor here, like we saw from those other models. So jump back to compare those, versus like the GFS ensemble, which pushes more of that precipitation into the Midwest. So we'll have to keep an eye on these differences as we go into next weekend and beyond, out into that last weekend of January. Kind of depends on, where that trough sets up in the Pacific that the ECMWF had an eye on. We see in the GFS ensemble, that trough stays well west in the Pacific, like north of Hawaii. That allows ridging to continue to dominate at the end of the month. It allows that cold air to stay situated across the Midwest and the eastern U.S. and a lack of precip for the entire Northwest, save for areas of British Columbia and Canada. So keep an eye on those differences. We typically lean in the long range toward the ECMWF because by the end of the year, it gets more of these scenarios right than the GFS, but it's only a handful of them, so we have to watch the GFS. It could be onto something here, but by and large, leaning a bit here early on the ECMWF ensemble right now, which is it's going a little bit against the MJO scenario that we talked about maybe as well. So a lack of confidence here in the long range, but that's not uncommon in wintertime. Speaking of the MJO, wanted to update us on that forecast quickly here. In phase 6, heading into phase 7 really quickly here. We kind of saw that with those westerlies pushing out into the Pacific. That takes us into the western Pacific and then quickly moving from there into the central Pacific. So be kind of curious. I'll be recording one of these, the 24th of next week. If we're seeing that wind burst stretching all the way through the central Pacific of like Thursday of next week during that video. And then in February, at least the ECMWF extended model, trying to push all the way into phase 2. Remember, Eric mentioned that scenario as a possibility yesterday by like the early to middle part of February. And if we look at some of those analogs for phase 2, that time of year, looks more troughing, cold snow across the east, maybe more of those snow showers, maybe a nor'easter finally, depending on how amplified this trough can get, but at least shows some better flow up through the Northwest, maybe the Cascades as well. So hoping for a turnaround there. We kind of compare this with just all February La Niñas in phase 2. We jump over and look at that one. We actually see in that scenario, deep troughing over the middle part of the country. And that would be interesting as well. So more of these analogs are not showcasing cold, I think, for the middle and eastern part of the country with some question marks out west. Hopeful that we return some better precipitation there. But just some question marks there given how bad that trend has been in the last 20 days or so. Last thing I'll kind of end the video on, Eric talked about this yesterday as well, is the polar vortex. If we take this forecast from the GFS ensemble, all the way out to the end of the period, we're talking like next weekend, even a little bit beyond, we're seeing this kind of, adjustment or shunting of it further over North America, these much higher heights here over Europe and Siberia. That doesn't leave a lot of room for that troughing to go anywhere else but here over North America. So curious if this, portends a cold air outbreak, 1 to 2 weeks after this, which would maybe line up with, La Nina phase 2s, with deep cold over the middle part of the country or maybe the eastern U.S. So I have to keep an eye on this scenario in February. Just kind of a sign right now. We looked at something similar to this at the end of November going into December to try to forecast some of the cold air that we saw in December, which ended up playing out. So another scenario like this to keep an eye on as we go forward. And we'll continue to do that right here. Thanks for watching.